Hello everybody, I'm going to do a little video review here on the first part of Unit 4, the respiratory system. I know some of you guys are planning to go ahead and knock that test out in advance of doing the test on the digestive system for Unit 4. So I've got some practice questions like we've done before here for the respiratory system. Respiration, there are a few key concepts you have to learn, and then really, if you nail down some of those types of things, for example, how carbon dioxide influences the pH of body fluids and how all that works, and the pressure differences that are involved with inspiration and expiration. Once you kind of get those types of things nailed down, you can actually reason your way through a lot of these questions. There's a few key concepts you got to learn. How about this first question? This is really more just a definition type question. Which process involves exchange of gases between the blood and the interstitial fluids? Okay, so respiration is very much involved in gas exchange, as hopefully you've figured out by now. And one of those gas exchange events involves the movement of gases between the blood, between the systemic capillaries that we learned about back in units 2 and 3, and the interstitial fluids. Remember, that's another term for the tissue fluids, the fluids that are bathing the cells in your tissues. So, which of these processes involves the exchange of gases between the blood and those tissue fluids? And hopefully you're thinking B, internal respiration. So what do these other terms mean that we have on here? Get my pen on here. So I can draw on the slide. We'll do in yellow. All right, how about cellular respiration? What is that referring to? Cellular respiration, hopefully you're thinking about that's down at the cell level, where cells are breaking down nutrients like glucose, harnessing the energy from that and using it to make ATP. And yes, you have learned before that generally the cellular respiration is going to work through an aerobic process that requires O2, oxygen gas. But that's not really what we're focusing in on here. Internal respiration, as we just discussed, that is the exchange of gases between the blood and your tissue fluids. What about external respiration? External respiration is referring to the exchange of gases between the air in the little tiny air sacs of the lungs, or the alveoli, and your pulmonary capillaries. So that's referred to as external respiration. So go back and look at all these definitions. They're at the very first part of the chapter on the respiratory system. And finally, ventilation is referring to the movement of air in and out of the lungs. So our correct answer there was B. All right, how about this one? This one's actually more of an anatomy question. Which of these is not part of the functional anatomy of the respiratory system? Nasal cavity, oropharynx, larynx, and esophagus. And hopefully that one's not too hard for you. The esophagus is not part of the respiratory system. The esophagus, of course, is the muscular tube that extends from the laryngopharynx back down to the stomach. So that's really going to be part of the digestive system. Those other three compartments, nasal cavity, the oropharynx, the larynx, all three of those are going to be part of the functional anatomy of the respiratory system. And don't forget to review, you should be able to trace the pathway of a molecule of oxygen gas all the way from the nares, the openings to your nasal cavity there, from there all the way to the alveoli in the lungs. What are all the compartments those are going to pass through? So be sure you can do that. And if you have questions about it, then post those over on the discussion board so we can talk about those. Okay, I had a little technical glitch there. Hopefully that's been all fixed and it won't come out strange in the video. Next question, the glottis opens and closes. To permit, we want to select all that apply. So again, we want to treat these almost like a true-false question as we go down the list. First of all, let's review what the glottis is. Go back and look at the diagram in your text or the PowerPoint if you need to. The glottis refers to the vocal cords and the opening between them. So the vocal cords, of course, are up at the very top of the larynx. Don't confuse the glottis with the epiglottis. That's the flap that closes over the top of the larynx when you swallow food or water, and that's what prevents food or water from traveling on down into the larynx, and from there down into the trachea, and then on downward from there into the lungs, which would not be a good thing if that happened. All right, how about A, passage of food? The glottis is going to open and close to permit A, passage of food from the laryngopharynx to the esophagus. And I'm hoping you were saying no to that. I don't think you does not have anything. The glottis is not the opening into the esophagus. It's going to be the opening into the larynx. So that's going to be false. Does it allow air to pass from the laryngopharynx into the larynx? Yes, so the glottis has to be open in order for air to be able to pass from the laryngopharynx and down into the larynx, because that's going to be where it needs to go on its way downward toward the lungs. C, swallowing. No, the glottis is not really going to be involved in swallowing. How about creation of vocal sounds? Yes, the glottis opening and closing is very much involved in the creation of your vocal sounds. Gas exchange in the larynx. Hopefully you're thinking no on that one. We don't have gas exchange in the larynx. Gas exchange is taking place down in the lungs. So our correct answers there were B and D. Those are the two you would select. Okay, the tiniest air-filled compartment of the lung. A, alveolus. B, alveolar duct. C, the terminal bronchiole. D, the pulmonary capillary. Tiniest air-filled compartment of the lung. Hopefully you are thinking alveolus. Do go back and review all of the respiratory tubing, those passageways that lead all the way through their respiratory tract from one end down to the other. And it gets a little confusing when you get down to the bronchiole level, because you have larger bronchioles, and then those lead to terminal bronchioles, which lead to respiratory bronchioles, which lead to alveolar ducts, duct with a T, not a K. And then those are very tiny air-filled tubes that lead to clusters of alveoli. You can think of the alveoli, plural, almost look like grape clusters, and each individual grape is an alveolus. All right, breathing mechanics here. Pressure with, this is where you got to kind of read slowly and carefully and think about what's going on. And you got to remember these pressure-volume relationships. So, generally as volume goes up, like when the lungs increase in size, pressure's going down. If you decrease volume, like if you're squeezing on a balloon that's filled with air, you're going to increase the pressure inside that balloon. Same thing with your lungs. If your lungs are getting squeezed, they're getting pushed, the pressure's going up, and that's going to force air out of the lungs. So you want to think about those pressure-volume relationships that exist. Generally, if one's going up, the other one is going down. All right, pressure within the pleural cavity. So let's read through these and think about them. A, must exceed pressure within the lungs to allow inspiration. So the pleural cavity, and you should know how to define the pleural cavity. The pleural cavity is a potential space. It's not very big. Sometimes it's called a potential space because the space is so minimal it barely exists. But it's the space between the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura. All right, so remember I'm sorry, that should be pleura, plural, pleura. The pleury, with an AE on the end, that's the plural term for pleura. That's a double fold of serous membrane, like you have learned about before, where one layer directly contacts the lungs, that's the visceral pleura, and then the other layer lines the pleural cavity. That's going to be called the parietal pleura. And there's a little bit of space, a little bit of fluid-filled space in between the two, and that's called your pleural cavity. All right, so should the pressure in that cavity exceed the pressure within the lungs to allow inspiration? And hopefully you're thinking no on that one. If the pressure was higher in the pleural cavity, then that's going to squeeze on the lungs. That's going to cause the lungs to deflate rather than inflate, right? So that one's not going to be correct. How about it must be lower than the pressure within the lungs to allow inspiration? Remember, inspiration is another term for inhalation, so you want to be sure you know that. And then what's the term for exhalation? And we're learning about the respiratory system. It's expiration is the counterpart to that. That's exhaling. All right, so if your pressure within the pleural cavity is lower than it is within the lungs, yes, that's going to allow air to flow into the lungs and they're going to be able to inflate. So that one's actually true. How about C, must be equal to the pressure within the lungs to maintain homeostasis? No, because we need air to move into the lungs during inspiration. We want them to be able to inflate, so we need the pressure inside the lungs to actually be higher, just like if you were blowing into a balloon so that the balloon can inflate. And how about D, must be higher than pressure within the lungs to push carbon dioxide out of the blood. Now we do want carbon dioxide to move out of the blood and into the air spaces of the lungs, into those little alveoli, but that's not going to have anything to do with pressure in the pleural cavity. All right, the job of your inspiratory muscles. Is it A, to contract and force air out of the lungs during expiration? So here there's some things you just gotta know and keep straight in order to, because several of these answers might sound reasonable to you. How about B, to contract and pull on the lungs so they will inflate? C, to relax and allow the lungs to expand for inspiration? D, to contract and expand the thoracic cavity, which allows the lungs to expand? And hopefully you're thinking there, D. When your inspiratory muscles contract, and what is the inspiratory muscle? It's a breathing muscle. Which one is the key one involved in breathing? And hopefully you're thinking the diaphragm. The diaphragm, when it is relaxed, kind of looks like a dome. Your lungs are up here. There's your two lungs. Now it's not quite that much of a dome, but I'm drawing it to exaggerate. That's what it looks like when it's relaxed. When it contracts, it's going to move downward like that. So it's actually going to flatten out a little bit, and that's going to give you more room in the thoracic cavity to expand the lungs. So contraction of the diaphragm makes it flatten out. That gives you more room in the thoracic cavity. Remember what we just said about pressure? When volume goes up, the volume in the thoracic cavity is going up, which means pressure is going down, and that's going to allow air is now going to want to flow in to the lungs. The air out here, your air pressure outside the body is exceeding the pressure in the thoracic cavity, in the pleural cavities, and that's going to allow that air to flow into the lungs and fill them up. So D is your correct answer. During expiration or exhalation, the diaphragm actually relaxes, returns to a dome-like shape, and all right, so if you think about that, that's going to now squeeze on the lungs, and that's going to help force air to move out of the lungs. So the air pressure within the lungs exceeds the atmospheric air pressure out here, just like if you were squeezing on a balloon, and that air is going to flow outward. So you just have to kind of learn that. Contraction of the diaphragm is like this. The diaphragm is flattening and it's increasing your volume and lowering your pressure in the thoracic cavity, which allows inspiration to occur. It's tempting to think about those muscles need to contract to force air out of the lungs. That's kind of the way you might instinctively want to think about it, but it goes the other way as well. And don't forget, we have other muscles that participate in helping with inspiration. You've got your intercostal muscles between your ribs. Those are also very important. They also contract and pull on the ribs and help expand the thoracic cavity. Those are the key ones, and you may have learned before, like your pectoralis minor, muscle is involved, the sternocleidomastoideus muscles. Hopefully that's ringing a bell from Biology 201. They also help expand the thoracic cavity during the deepest types of breathing. All right, how about this one? The tendency of the walls of alveoli to be attracted to each other. What is the term for that? And hopefully you're thinking alveolar surface tension. Alveolar surface tension, so these alveoli, these little tiny air sacs in the lungs, they're kind of roundish, they kind of look like grapes. Here's another one over here, here's another one over here. And these are very, very thin. The walls of those are 1 cell thick. They're wet, they're covered with fluid. And so just like if you think about like a wet Kleenex that wants to, the parts of that wet Kleenex all want to cling to each other and make a big wad and a mess, that would happen in your alveoli. What did we learn about that counteracts that? You actually have a substance inside the alveoli that helps prevent the walls of the alveoli from collapsing in on each other like that. And hopefully you're thinking about surfactant. It's kind of a slippery type fluid that helps prevent the walls of the alveoli from collapsing upon each other. So that tendency for the walls of the alveoli to be attracted to each other is called surface tension. And so the surfactant helps reduce that so that those alveoli stay inflated and filled with air. Of course, you got air in here, inside those spaces. Alveolar compliance, no. Alveolar resistance, no. Pneumothorax, anybody remember what that means? That's one of the homeostatic imbalances we talked about. That's where if you get a puncture that enters into the pleural cavity, you can wind up admitting air into the pleural cavity, into that space between the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura. And that will, remember how the air pressure in there is supposed to be lower than it is in your lungs in order to allow your lungs to inflate. If you have a pneumothorax, things reverse and the pressure in there can exceed the pressure in the lungs, and that makes the lung collapse. That's also known as atelectasis. Go back and check out that term if that sounds foreign to you. All right, select each of the following that may decrease lung compliance. And let's review what lung compliance means. Really all lung compliance is referring to is, how efficient, what's the difference between the amount of air in the lungs during inspiration versus expiration. So in other words, how good are you at moving air in and out of the lungs? Can you take in enough air to oxygenate your blood properly, and can you exhale enough air to get rid of proper amounts of carbon dioxide? That's lung compliance. All right, so which of these would decrease lung compliance? How about A? This is one of those multiple answer questions. Weak inspiratory muscles. Yeah, if your inspiratory muscles are weak for some reason, including muscular diseases like muscular dystrophy, this can be a problem within those patients. Remember, you can't expand your thoracic cavity as well. If you can't contract those inspiratory muscles and expand your thoracic cavity, you're not going to be able to take in as much air. How about lung tissue fibrosis? This is where the connective tissues of the lungs that are really critical for making your lungs have the stretchability and the elasticity that they need to function properly. Fibrosis is where you have those tissues become too fibrous and they're not nearly as elastic as they need to be. And if your lungs are not as elastic, it's in order for you to be able to inspire and expire, your lungs have to be able to expand and then snap back to help move that air back out of the lungs during exhalation. Strong expandability of the lungs. I would say no on that one. If your lungs are expandable, that's going to be good for your lung compliance. Poor production of surfactant, absolutely. If your alveoli are collapsing the walls of your alveoli are collapsing into each other, you're going to be able to move less air into the lungs. Scar tissue over the thoracic cavity due to a burn. This is an interesting one. We're going to say yes on that as well. And you may recall, if you may have done a Burns case study in your biology 201 class where this actually came up. And sometimes people who experience burns over the, on the skin around the thoracic cavity, you get so much scar tissue there that your chest, the thoracic region, just simply can't expand as much as it needs to during deep breathing. And so that also is going to reduce your lung compliance. You're not going to be able to move quite as much air into the lungs as you would if you did not have that scar tissue. Okay, respiratory volumes and capacities. This topic tends to give students a lot of fits, and it's really not that hard when you just think through it logically, think about what the phrases are saying, what the terminology is saying to you. It's not all that hard to learn, even though it tends to freak people out at first. So let's just kind of quickly go back through these. Tidal volume, and just kind of practice these on yourself as well to help you learn them. Tidal volume is the amount of air, the volume of air that you inhale and exhale just during normal breathing. Normal, you're not even thinking about breathing. Tidal volume. That's about 500 milliliters, a half a liter, for both males and females. The inspiratory reserve volume, that's the extra amount of air that you can forcefully inhale, your deepest inhale. So that's going to be your inspiratory reserve volume. So it's beyond a normal tidal volume inhale. And notice in males that's about 3,100, and average female it's about 1,900. So the average male can deliberately, forcefully inhale more air than the average female can. Your expiratory reserve volume, so after you do a normal exhale, and then you exhale out as much extra air as possible, and how much air can you force out of the lungs? That's about 1,200 in a male and 700 in a female. And finally, residual volume, about 1,200 milliliters in a male, 1,100 milliliters in a female. You cannot force all of the air out of your lungs no matter how hard you try. If you did that, your lungs would collapse. So you've got to keep some air in those respiratory passages and the alveoli and so forth in the lungs. So you're always going to have some residual volume. So if you just think about, practice what those volumes mean and look at the terminology there, and hopefully it will make sense to you. The capacities can be a little bit harder, but they make sense as well. Total lung capacity, about 6,000 in males and 4,200 in females. Total lung capacity, all of those respiratory volumes that we just talked about added up together. If your lungs are fully inflated, what will be the air volume in your lungs? So it's your tidal volume, inspiratory reserve, expiratory reserve, and then the residual volume. All of those added up together. Now, vital capacity, vital refers to life. So your total lung capacity is everything, including that residual volume, which you can never, no matter how hard you try, you're not going to be able to blow that out of the lungs. Vital capacity is really what's the total amount of air that with a maximum inhale and a maximum exhale you can move in and out of the lungs. And so that's calculated with the tidal volume plus the inspiratory reserve plus the expiratory reserve. So if you take the deepest inhale possible, you've now filled your lungs up to maximum capacity, and then you exhale all of that out and forcibly exhale out even more. That's your vital capacity. So the only difference between that one and total lung capacity is that residual volume that you have left over, which is about 1,200 in a male and 1,100 in a female, because you're never going to be able to get rid of that extra volume. Inspiratory capacity is going to be, that's the maximum amount of air that you can take into the lungs with a forceful inhale. after just a normal exhalation. So it's not going to be the same as a vital capacity. Vital capacity would be would include your expiratory reserve. This is just going to be your tidal volume plus that inspiratory reserve volume, just those two. All right, finally, functional residual capacity, FRC. I'm not likely to ask you that one on a test, but that is how much air remains in your lungs after just a normal expiration. So remember we said the residual volume over here, how much air is left in the lungs after a forceful exhalation. So no matter how hard you try, your residual volume is going to be left over. This is just letting you know, well, how much air is generally left over in your lungs after just a normal exhalation. So you have to add that expiratory reserve volume in there as well to get that value. And what are all these capacities and volumes used for? They can be measured with a spirometer, and they help the volumes and capacities in conjunction with how fast you can inhale and exhale, the rate at which you can forcibly inhale and exhale helps determine the types of lung function problems that some patients are having. Are they obstructive, which is generally a problem with exhalation? Are they restrictive, which is generally a problem with inspiring or inhaling air? And so you'll learn, you guys who are going into nursing or other healthcare areas will see these respiratory volumes and capacities again. All right, here's a question. The vital capacity of a patient with a tidal volume of 500 mLs, an inspiratory reserve volume of 2,300 milliliters, an expiratory reserve volume of 900 milliliters, and a residual volume of 1,200 milliliters. What will that be? So we just have to think about vital capacity. If I have forcefully exhaled and now I'm going to inhale, how much air can I take in altogether? I'm going to be able to take back in that expiratory reserve of about 900. I'm going to be able to take in that tidal volume, and I'm going to be able to take in that inspiratory reserve volumes. The residual volume here doesn't count because that's air that is, you're never going to be able, you started with that amount of air in the lungs. It was already there, so it's not part of this vital capacity. So 500, 2,300 plus 900 gives us 3,700 when we add those together. 4,900, answer D there, would be your total lung capacity, because there you would add in that residual volume. That's where you're trying to total up the absolute total amount of air that can exist in the lungs. All right, gas exchange. The partial pressure of oxygen gas in the alveoli. And again, remember, partial pressure, explain a little bit more detail in the video lectures and in your textbook. But basically, just it's a measurement of the concentration of a gas within air, or when you have a mixture of different gases in air or in a fluid, what it's basically just a measurement of the concentration of that gas is a good way to think about it. All right, so we have oxygen gas in the alveoli. So here we've got an alveolus. And then remember, the alveolus is going to have, my stylus just does not work real well on this iPad screen, so that's probably totally useless to you. Hang on. We've got an alveolus here with air on the inside, and then let's just say this is a pulmonary capillary over here. They don't really, they're not quite that big, and if you go back and look at your diagrams, they look more like webbing around an alveolus. So the pulmonary capillary has blood in it, and then the alveolus has air on the inside. And we're thinking about the amount, the partial pressure or the concentration of oxygen gas, O2, in an alveolus here. Is it higher than in the pulmonary capillaries, which allows oxygen to diffuse into the blood? So in other words, do you have O2 higher in the alveolus and lower over here in the pulmonary capillary? And remember, diffusion things move from where they are more concentrated to less. So if we think about that one, I would say yes, that makes sense. The O2 levels need to be higher in the air sacs of the lungs in order to cause that O2 to diffuse from the air into the blood in the pulmonary capillary, because remember, we're trying to oxygenate the blood. So we're going to need the O2 concentration, or the partial pressure, to be higher in the alveolus than it is in the blood. So actually our answer there is going to be A. But let's take a look at the other three and figure out why they're wrong. B says the partial pressure of oxygen gas in the alveoli lower than in the pulmonary capillaries, which allows carbon dioxide to diffuse out of the blood. All right, now yes, we do want CO2 to move from the pulmonary capillaries and into the air sacs of the lungs. We certainly want that to happen, but that's not going to depend on the oxygen levels in the alveoli. That's going to depend on the CO2 levels in the alveoli rather than the oxygen levels. All right, C. The partial pressure of oxygen gas in the alveoli is higher than in the pulmonary capillaries, so we've already said that's true, which allows carbon dioxide to diffuse out of the blood. Yes, that does happen. Carbon dioxide moves out of the blood and into the air sacs of the lungs, but it's not due to the partial pressure of oxygen gas. It's going to be due to the partial pressure of CO2. All right, and D. Partial pressure of oxygen gas in the alveoli is lower than in the pulmonary capillaries, so no, we've already said that's not the case, which allows oxygen to diffuse into the blood. No, that one's totally wrong. Everything's backwards on that one. So remember, if we're thinking about a pulmonary capillary over here, capillary, and we got the alveolus over here. In general, the air in an alveolus, the O2 levels are going to be higher, and the CO2 levels are going to be a little bit lower than in the pulmonary capillary. Pulmonary capillary, your O2 levels are lower. Remember, you got deoxygenated blood coming into the lungs to pick up oxygen gas, and your CO2 levels, sorry, the stylus is horrible, CO2 levels tend to be higher. All right, so diffusion, things move from where they're more concentrated to less. So in this setup, then, oxygen gas is going to want to diffuse out of the alveoli and into the pulmonary capillaries, into the blood. CO2 is going to do the reverse. The CO2 is going to move from the pulmonary capillaries over into the alveoli, so you can exhale out that excess carbon dioxide. All right, here's another gas exchange question. Select each of the following that is true about gas exchange. So this is one of those multiple answer type things. Now here we're going to have to, we've already talked about what's going on with external respiration. Remember, that's the exchange of gases that occurs between the blood in your pulmonary capillaries and the air in the alveoli of the lungs. How about internal respiration? And there you've got a tissue capillary in a tissue somewhere, and over here you got your tissue fluids over here. So in this case, what's going on? The capillaries in a tissue, in a systemic tissue, are bringing in oxygenated blood. So you have high O2 levels, and you have lower CO2 levels. Your tissues tend to have lower O2 levels because the cells in the tissue have been using the oxygen gas for cellular respiration. Remember, they're using that O2 for that energy gathering process. The cells in the tissues, remember, they give off carbon dioxide. That's a waste product of cellular respiration. So in your tissues, your CO2 levels tend to be elevated in an active tissue. So in your tissues, what's going to happen? O2 levels are higher in the blood in the capillaries, so therefore oxygen gas is going to tend to diffuse this way into your tissues. The reverse is true
for CO2. CO2 is going to move, it's going to diffuse, oops, your CO2 over here is going to want to diffuse from your, stylus is just worthless, from the tissues and into the capillaries. That's what allows the blood to carry away the CO2 waste from your tissues. And then where is that CO2 going to go? You've got this carbon dioxide rich blood, and that passes through the veins, goes back to the heart pumps it out to the lungs, and the CO2 through external respiration is going to move out of the blood and the pulmonary capillaries into the air sacs of the alveoli, and then you're going to, during expiration or exhalation, you're going to blow that air out, and that's how you get rid of your carbon dioxide. All right, select each of the following that is true about gas exchange. The partial pressure of oxygen gas in tissue fluids is generally higher than in arterial blood. Remember, your arterial blood is your oxygen-rich blood when we're thinking about the systemic circuit. All right, that one's false. Hang on, I'm getting a phone call. All right, B, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in tissue fluids is generally higher than in arterial blood. Yes, that one's true. That's what we just talked about. That's why, in terms of the blood coming into a capillary, out of the arteries and an arteriole, you're going to, the CO2 levels are generally going to be lower in that blood than they are in the tissues. That's going to allow CO2 to diffuse out of your tissues and into the capillaries. How about the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in alveolar air is generally lower than in your venous blood or venous blood? Yep, that one's going to be true as well. Because remember, we want the CO2 to move out of this venous blood, this deoxygenated blood, and eventually move into the air sacs of the lungs. And then finally, D, the partial pressure of oxygen gas in arterial blood is generally higher than in venous or venous blood. Yes, that's true as well. Arterial blood, when you're thinking about the systemic circuit, arterial blood is oxygenated, and your blood in your veins is deoxygenated, so it's going to be lower in oxygen gas levels. All right, here's another one. Select each that causes more oxygen gas to dissociate from hemoglobin. So remember, most oxygen gas, not all, but most oxygen gas in the blood is attached to hemoglobin. Remember, hemoglobin consists of, you got 4 globin proteins that are connected together. And then kind of in the center, you have a heme group in each one. And the heme has an iron attached to it. And then each of those can bind an O2, an oxygen gas molecule. So each individual hemoglobin in your red blood cells, now remember, a red blood cell is basically just a sack of billions and billions of these hemoglobin molecules, and each of those can have 4 oxygen gas molecules attached. So every red blood cell, and you've got bazillions of those, is carting around a lot of oxygen gas molecules. All right, and so as these red blood cells are traveling through the capillaries in your tissues, they don't unload, just under normal circumstances, they don't unload all of those oxygen gas molecules and release those to your tissues. They're going to hang on to quite a few of them. All right, and then certain things influence how many of those on an average hemoglobin molecule over here, how many of those are actually going to dissociate, that means come off the hemoglobin and go into your surrounding tissue fluids. There are various things that influence how frequently that happens. All right, so let's say A here, you've got low O2 levels in your tissue fluids. So that means your tissues are starving for O2. So is that something that you would expect would trigger more O2 to come off of your hemoglobin? Hopefully you're thinking yes on that one. How about higher body temperature? Higher body temperature will actually stimulate more O2 to come off. And again, this is where you just kind of start kind of thinking logically through what's going on. Higher body temperature can be like, let's say you're exercising. Metabolism is going up. Remember, increased heat often means increased metabolism, generally does. Increased metabolism means the cells are consuming more oxygen gas and they're going to need more. So that's another thing that will trigger more O2 to come off. How about low pH? Low pH is also something that can trigger more O2 to come off. And with low pH, you got to start thinking about what we've learned with regard to metabolism and how that impacts the pH of your body fluids. So if cells in a tissue are doing lots and lots and lots of cellular respiration, what are they giving off lots of? What are they're breaking down glucose? What are they making from that? Hopefully you're thinking lots of CO2. Lots of metabolism increases CO2 levels. What have we learned about in this respiratory chapter about carbon dioxide? Carbon dioxide does what to your body fluid pH? Just think about it as CO2 functions like an acid. Acids lower your pH. So low pH is an indication that your tissues are very metabolically active. If they're more metabolically active, what are they going to need more of? They're going to need more oxygen gas. All right. How about high O2 levels in tissue fluids? No. If you've already got plenty of oxygen gas in your tissues, then you don't need more. So that's not going to trigger more O2 to unload off of your hemoglobin. The hemoglobin trucks are not going to drop off more oxygen gas for your tissues. How about low CO2 levels in tissue fluids? No, we just talked about how high CO2 levels actually are an indication, hey, there's lots of metabolism going on here. We need the hemoglobin trucks to drop off more oxygen gas to keep that cellular respiration going. All right, next one. Most CO2 molecules are transported in the blood in what form? A, bound to hemoglobin, B, dissolved in plasma, C, bonded to red blood cells, or D, as part of bicarbonate ions. All right, hopefully you're thinking D on this one. As part of bicarbonate ions. Some of it is attached to hemoglobin, not at the same place where the oxygen gas is attached to those irons on the heme groups, but some of it does become bonded to hemoglobin. Some of it is dissolved in plasma, the liquid of the blood, kind of like a carbonate. It's kind of like CO2 is dissolved in a carbonated beverage that you're drinking. It's kind of the same concept there. But most of it is transported through the blood in the form of bicarbonate ions. And where do those come from? Let's review our equation. You've got CO2 reacts with water molecules, and there's an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase that makes this happen. And when you put those two molecules together, you get H2CO3. That's called carbonic acid. Acids tend to break apart into two ions, a positively charged hydrogen ion and a negatively charged ion. And in this case, the other negatively charged ion is this one. That's bicarbonate right there. It's called a bicarbonate ion, has a negative charge to it. So the CO2 over here is now over here in that ion. This is a back and forth or a reversible chemical reaction that we're learning about here. And what that means is when your blood gets to the lungs, so it's in the pulmonary capillaries, and you've got very lower CO2 levels in the air of the alveoli, so we need the CO2s that are now part of these HCO3 bicarbonate ions. The CO2s need to come back out, so this chemical reaction works in reverse. So the bicarbonates will combine with hydrogen ions to make bicarbonate ions will go back that way, and then these break apart into CO2 and water, and the CO2 diffuses out of the blood and into the air of the lungs. So just keep in mind that's a back and forth type of chemical reaction. This chemical reaction will come up again when we talk about the urinary system and pH control, more when we get to Unit 5. So you will be seeing this again. So don't flush it out of your memory as soon as the respiratory system comes to an end. All right, increased production of carbon dioxide by cells. What happens? All right, and I probably should not have erased our chemical reaction. You know, let's write that back out again if my pen will cooperate here. Most CO2 that gets produced by your cells, there's an enzyme that bonds those CO2 molecules to water. That creates carbonic acid. And then that quickly breaks apart into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate, negatively charged ions. All right, pH is influenced. pH is basically a measurement of those hydrogen ions. Those hydrogen ions are very chemically reactive. You got to have a certain concentration of those for all of your important biological molecules to work properly. So one of the key aspects of homeostasis in the body is to keep the levels of these little critters where they need to be. Hydrogen ions are really important. pH is a measurement of the concentration of hydrogen ions in a fluid. Unfortunately, there's a mathematical reason for this, but an increase in hydrogen ion concentration, the pH value goes down, it's lower, it's below 7. Decreased hydrogen ion concentration results in a higher pH value. And there is a mathematical reason for that. When you take chemistry, if you have to, you will learn about it. Incidentally, if you ever see something written like this, a chemical of some type with little brackets around it, that means concentration of something. All right, so let's go back to our question here then, now that we've reviewed some of the basics. Increased production of carbon dioxide by cells, so like if they're doing lots and lots of metabolism, like let's say you're exercising really vigorously, or if you're sick, you're fighting an infection, that's another thing that's going to increase your metabolism to help you fight the infection and make all those white blood cells that you need to help you destroy the bacteria or the virus that has invaded your body. All right, increased production of CO2 by cells. A, results in decreased production of carbonic acid, which raises the blood pH. I would say no on that one. If you have more CO2 over here, then you've got more of that to combine with water, which is going to give you more carbonic acid. And the more carbonic acid you have, more of this is going to happen, which means you're going to wind up with more hydrogen ions. And what will increased hydrogen ions do to your pH? A higher hydrogen ion concentration means a lower pH value. So A is going to be wrong. It's going to result, B results in production of more carbonic acid, which lowers your blood pH. Yes, that's correct. Results in a lower concentration of hydrogen ions. No. So we can read the first part and we know that one's wrong. D results in a higher concentration of hydrogen ions. Yes. Which increases the blood pH. No, and that's where you just have to read carefully and make sure you know that relationship between hydrogen ion concentrations and pH. It's flipped. So higher hydrogen ion concentration, lower pH. Lower hydrogen ion concentration, higher pH value. So again, just read carefully. And again, like I was saying, a lot of these things, if you just know some of these key concepts, you can reason your way through a lot of these questions. Excuse me. All right, so if you have a patient with rapid respiration, or anybody with rapid respiration, So you're exhaling very frequently. All right, so if that happens, um, this is a pH question. pH is not influenced by O2 levels, it's influenced by CO2 levels. So let's just kind of think logically. Rapid respiration, which can be referred to as hyperventilation, excessive ventilation going on. Ugh, stylus is driving me crazy. All right. All right, so if you have lower CO2 levels, all right, and y'all, yes, think about your equation, but to me, if you just think about CO2, think about it like it's an acid, because the more CO2 you have around, the more carbonic acid you're going to make. Less CO2, less carbonic acid. So you can kind of think about CO2 as functioning like an acid in your body fluids. So if you have excessive loss of CO2 because you're hyperventilating, what's that going to do to your blood pH? You have less acid in your blood. Acidic pHs are lower, but you've got less acid, so what's going to happen? It's going to increase the pH of your body fluid. So it looks like A will be, well, this is a select all that applies, so yes, we're going to pick that one. B can cause excessive increase of O2, which will lower the blood pH. You're going to be taking more oxygen gas in, but oxygen gas does not influence pH levels. C, lead to a decrease in hydrogen ion concentration in the blood. All right, so we said we've got an increase in pH. Increased pH means lower hydrogen ion concentration, like we were just talking about. Those two values are flip-flopped from each other. And then D, can help raise the pH when needed, as during intense exercise. That's actually true. So if we think through it, you're exercising really heavily. Let me erase all that stuff. You are exercising really heavily. What's going to increase? CO2 is going to increase in your tissue fluids, which is going to do what to the pH of your body fluids? pH of your body fluids is going to go down. Remember, we've got to keep that between 7.35 and 7.45 in order for you to be able to stay healthy. So one of the main ways that your body controls the pH is to control CO2 levels through respiration. So if you're exercising, when you intensively exercise, you're probably thinking, I gotta suck in more oxygen gas to support all this exercise that I'm doing, and that's correct. But actually, one of the key reasons why you're breathing so hard is to get rid of all this excess CO2, because this excess CO2 has such a profound impact on your body fluid pH, and that will likely kill you before the limited oxygen gas levels you're taking in. So that one is a correct answer as well, A, C, and D. All right, controlling respiration. Inspiratory neurons in the ventral respiratory group. Remember, that is a cluster of neurons in the medulla over on the ventral side, the front side, that are involved in stimulating. They control the inspiratory muscles like the diaphragm and the intercostals that are responsible for breathing. So the inspiratory neurons, now if we just think about that logically, those are neurons that are going to stimulate inspiration. So are they stimulating your inspiratory muscles? A, yes. B, are they inhibiting your inspiratory muscles? No. You do have expiratory neurons that inhibit those muscles from contracting. C, will they fire action potentials more frequently when O2 levels are high? So think about it. All right, these are neurons. If they fire action potentials more frequently, they would stimulate the inspiratory muscles to contract more frequently, which would increase your number of respirations and probably the depth as well. Do you need to do that if your O2 levels are already high? No, you don't. You don't need to breathe more if you already have high O2 levels. Do they stimulate the muscles that constrict the thoracic cavity? That might sound reasonable at first, but don't forget, your inspiratory muscles don't constrict the thoracic cavity. They allow it to expand and get bigger so that the lungs can fill up with air. So your answer there is A. Which of these is true about the influence of very low arterial partial pressure of oxygen gas on respiration? Leads to decreased depth and rate of breathing. Hopefully not. If you have really low oxygen gas levels in your blood, you need more oxygen gas. So hopefully that's not going to decrease your depth and your rate of breathing. Leads to inhibition of the inspiratory neurons in the VRG. That's your ventral respiratory group in the medulla. No, again, that's the same thing as A. We don't want that to happen. Does it cause the pH of body fluids to increase? No, body fluid pH is influenced by CO2, not O2, so keep that in mind. Leads to increased depth and rate of breathing. Yes, I would pick D on that one. And again, you can just kind of logically think your way through that. And don't forget, too, if you had a question that was asking you, are CO2 levels more important for controlling breathing rate or O2 levels? It's actually the CO2. CO2 levels have the most immediate influence on your breathing rate and depth, because like we're talking about, the amount of CO2 in your body fluids is one of the key things, or the key thing, that influences the pH of your body fluids, and maintaining proper body fluid pH is absolutely critical for survival. All right, if you have low pH levels in the blood caused by accumulation of ketone bodies in a diabetic, ketone bodies are a byproduct of breaking down fats, and diabetics, because they don't have, they're not very good at using the glucose in their blood, or not very many of the cells in their body can't take up glucose because they're having insulin problems. They have to break down fats for energy, and ketone bodies are a byproduct of that, and they are acidic, they're acids, and so as they build up in the blood, that can cause a condition called ketoacidosis. All right, and so what's that ketoacidosis? You've got these ketone bodies building up. That's going to do what to the pH? That's going to lower the pH of body fluids. All right, so your respiratory system plays an important role in controlling body fluid pH. We need the pH to go back up, right? All right, so think about CO2. Whenever you're controlling body fluid pH with CO2, all right, if you slow down your breathing rate, you're going to hang on to more CO2. If you exhale more, you're going to release more CO2. And if you release more CO2, what is that going to do to your pH? Remember, CO2 functions like an acid, so if you blow more of it off, it's going to help raise your pH. All right, so that's what we want to do here. We want to blow out more CO2 to help elevate the pH of the body fluids. So which of these answers is correct? Looks to me like it's going to be C, should trigger increased respiration. If you blow out more CO2, that's going to help raise your body fluid pH back up. Hypoventilation, B, would be where the breathing rate slows down. That would allow CO2 to accumulate. You're not blowing as much of it out of the lungs, so it's staying in the blood, and that helps lower your pH if you were in a situation where you needed to do that. All right, a homeostatic imbalance question. I think this is the last one. COPD, go back and review what we discussed with regard to those homeostatic imbalances at the end of the chapter. This stands for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which includes bronchitis and emphysema, and it includes the following features. Select all that apply. So people have COPD, like I think about 80% of those are smokers. A, frequent pulmonary infections, absolutely. They have lots of trouble with those. Loss of elasticity in connective tissues of the lungs, absolutely. So that means, the lungs, if they inflate, they can't rebound properly because you don't have enough elasticity. That's that snapback in the connective tissues of the lungs that helps force air out of the lungs. So people with COPD often have problems with elasticity, so they can't exhale properly. Dyspnea, that's irregular breathing, absolutely. Dyspnea, that's a term you should be aware of. Improper breathing rate. Chronic bronchial inflammation, lots of mucus in the bronchial passages of the lungs, absolutely. And smokers are going to have that. Remember, they lose the cilia, those ciliated linings down in the lower respiratory tract that help sweep dust and microorganisms out of the lungs. So that's one of the things that leads to lots of infections, and the cigarette smoke damages the linings of all those tissues down in the lungs. How does the body respond to damaged tissues? Through inflammation. So you have constant inflammation. Hypoxemia, what does that refer to? Remember, emia, when you see that, that's referring to something in the blood. Hypox, like hypoxia, that's low oxygen gas levels in tissues. Hypoxemia, when you see that, that's referring to low oxygen gas levels in the blood. So you want to pick that one as well. COPD, you have poor lung function, so you're going to have poor oxygenation of the lungs. All right, I think that's it for the review. And again, if you have, as always, if you have additional questions about the respiratory system, please be sure to post those over on the discussion board so we can discuss those with the rest of the class. Good luck with your preparation for the respiratory system, and again, don't hesitate to bring up some questions or have some discussion with the rest of the class. It improves the quality of the class for all of the other students as well. Good luck.